Hey guys, welcome back to this video where I'm going to go through some of my recent game analysis from the recent Online Olympiad tournament where we narrowly missed out by about half a point of qualifying from the main event. So I hope you learn a thing or two. Sit back and enjoy the video. So the first game we played was against Kyrgyzstan and the game went into a Catalan after d5 e6. And then white goes defeating Keto, the light squared bishop, castles, and black takes on c4. Queen c2, this is one of the main lines of this position. After a6, black wants to play b5 if we recapture the pawn on c4 in order to develop this bishop on c8, which is often the problem piece in the Catalan. a4 is a very trendy try at the moment to try and get an advantage, stops b5. And here the most common response is to play bishop to d7. And bring the bishop to c6 where it's nice developed outside the pawn chain. However, my opponent went for knight bd7, played knight bd2 to recapture with the knight, c5 to challenge the center. This is also fairly normal. Captures, knight takes c4 and queen e7. So black wants to play the move pawn to e5 here and then develop that problem bishop from c8 outside the pawn chain. So we should stop e5, and the most logical way is bishop to f4, developing a piece, and also keeping an eye on this pawn break. Black played knight to d5, so we drop our bishop back to d2. Now there's options of playing e4 to kick the knight away from d5. He played h6. I play a5 here. So I thought he was going to play b6 at some point and maybe bring the bishop to b7. So this is the idea of a5. We do have this weakness on b4, but I didn't think it was a huge problem. And here after the knight f6, he's threatening to play bishop d7 and bishop b5. If the bishop gets to b5, then there won't be any problems for black. So we played the move knight to e5 here, bishop to d7, and of course the bishop's going to b5. So if you've seen my series on the bishop pair, you'll know that it's definitely a good idea to take this bishop immediately on the d7 so it never gets into the game. Knight takes d7 and queen b3. So we're just putting pressure on black's queen side here and using the power of the two bishops. Rook to b8. Played rook a to d1. So I don't think black is ready yet to play the move b5 because we can always en passant, and there's also ideas of knight a5 in some cases. Knight f6. So here we played e4. Knight c7, and then we just put more pressure on black's setup. So just play the move bishop to f4. This also stops e5 from being played, so the knight can't reroute to e6. Also the knight is pinned, so it can't go to b5. We swap the pair of rooks. So this way we get the rook to the open d file. And I think after bishop f3 already white has got a very nice advantage. So I continued on by capturing in knight e5. So now there's a threat of knight c6 that's coming. Rook to d8. Yeah, but after this I think white is winning because we just take on b7 and take on g4 here. So we just exchange some pieces, and here we set up a nice little trap, going knight to e3. So if the black queen takes, we have this move pawn to b4, and the queen can't defend the knight, which black went for. So after b4 we win the knight, so this should be fairly easy to convert now. A piece up, and mate on h4. So the next game we had a stronger GM opponent against Bangladesh. So we had the white pieces here. After d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, my opponent played bishop to b4 fairly quickly. And if your opponent plays bishop b4 this quickly, usually they're hinting at some ideas of taking on c4. What I would normally do is play knight f3, but I think he would have taken and then gone for this b5 line, which is very, very sharp and can be double-edged, especially if your opponent's prepared it beforehand. So to avoid all this, I decided just to play e3, just defend the pawn, transpose back into a normal Nimzo Indian structure. Take on d5. So whenever your opponent plays b6, you can always consider taking on d5. Force them to take back with the pawn, where this bishop will always be blocked if it goes to b7. Followed by knight to e5. So here my opponent played c4, but I think it might be a better idea for him to consider just taking the knight on c3 and then maybe play bishop a6, exchange these bishops, and I think black is doing absolutely fine here. Instead, c4 closes the position and also removes the option of bishop a6. And here I spent a little bit of time as white, because the obvious move you want to play is to go f4. But f4 is very weakening. So after f4 you can't take the pawn back, and you also weaken his e4 square quite a bit. So after a bit of thought, we decided to go with queen f3 instead. So we want to put pressure on the king side somehow. This way we don't commit too many weaknesses. So the queen goes to h3, this is the whole idea. So putting pressure here on h7 pawn and creating some ideas on maybe knight g4 or some threats along these lines. And here probably the best move is just to take the bishop back, but I decided to go for this tricky knight to d7. It doesn't actually end up winning anything, it just trades off a few pieces, but yeah, worth it. Just for, if he takes there with the queen, then we have bishop takes h7, this is the whole idea. If the knight takes on h7, then we take the queen. King h8, we have bishop f5 also. So he played the move h6, which is a good move. We can't actually take the rook here because then our knight gets trapped. So he moves his bishop and the knight gets trapped. So we take the knight, queen takes, and then just take the bishop. So here again we have the two bishop pair, and we also have a very good pawn center. And the plan is just to play f3, e4, and then push e5, f4, f5, and roll our pawns forward. Queen g3, f3. So the queen wants to go back to f2 to stop any ideas of knight takes d4 when you play e4. b5, rook b1. So here I have a very comfortable position. It should be a huge advantage actually, just winning. But we go wrong a little bit here. So I spent a little bit too much time. Rook e1's a little bit too fancy. I think we should have just played the move bishop to e4, and this is just completely winning for white because the move pawn to d6 is coming, and there's not much black can do about this. Yeah, again we should have just played bishop e4 here. It's just completely winning because knight takes, rook takes, and then rook to e8 is winning a piece. Instead we played d6, knight d5, bishop d2, and we actually end up losing this pawn. We still have an advantage here in this position, but it's totally unnecessary to have lost that pawn. Okay, and here we get low in time pressure, so the moves don't make as much sense anymore. So just trying to get through the time pressure. And there's a few serious mistakes. I think this is probably one of the first serious mistakes king here, where white had to deal with knight to f4 check. So if knight to f4 check, I think we have to give up a pawn, and maybe the ending's gonna end up in a draw. So that was probably black's best opportunity here. And again, I think he can play knight to f4 check. That might also be a good option here. So he played it here, which is probably not the right move. And definitely he blundered here with knight takes g2. So here we're just a piece up, and black resigned the game. It was decided in the time trouble scramble at the end, but I think white had a nice advantage the whole way through. So the third game, we just decided to try out this Sveshnikov Sicilian for the first time. I think it's the first game I've ever actually played a Sveshnikov Sicilian in a serious tournament. So I had no idea what my opponent was going to play, although he has played this particular line in the past before. He could have played a number of options. So I went for this bishop to d3. So the most solid option against this is to go bishop e6 and just chop this knight on d5, drop the knight back to e7. But we decided for something a little bit more sharper and more interesting for this one, since it's an online game with rapid time control. So we go f4 and rook g8. So we're just completely forego castling here, and we're just playing for a big attack and a lot of tactical opportunities. Probably the best move is to go bishop h6, but there have been a number of games where black has played bishop g4 to stop casting with bishop h3 as well, so decided to give this a go. I think the best move for white is just to go queen d3 here, but he opted to take, after which I just go bishop h6. So we just want to get some compensation. If he takes on e5, then we just take back with the knight, and both bishops are doing a good job of stopping white from castling either way. So f5 was played, and here I was going to play the move queen h4, but then I think knight c7 check is quite good, and I was going to get king d7, but then I'm not sure what happens after, say, even queen d5 options, or just taking the rook and then queen d5 after. Did spend a little bit of time on this though. After takes, bishop e3 is very interesting, going for this checkmate on e3, but I think queen d5, just let me check. Yeah, queen d5, queen takes f2, king d1 is perfectly fine for white here. So instead I went king f8, bishop to f3, and then queen h4, queen d3, and it's hard to actually come up with a plan here for black, and the only plan I could come up with was to take on f5 and go for some tactics, which is why I played the move rook to d8. So threatening bishop to f5, I think he should just play knight to c2, and computer's giving here about equal. But in the game he played king to e2, and now of course I should take on f5. It's the only move. If I don't take on f5, I don't think there's anything else. And after knight to c2, I just drop the bishop back to e6. And now I'm fairly happy with my position. I have two bishops, and at least we get rid of this f5 pawn. So rook g6 was played, knight e3, so knight e7. Yeah, so I thought knight takes e7, knight d5 was probably the best option as well. But instead he went for this knight f5, and then we have this nice knight takes d5 idea. And he can't actually take the queen because there's this knight f4 checks, which would pick up material. So he took here, queen takes, but now we have, actually we have queen c4 check, which would have been a nice move as well. So this is probably more accurate than what I played. Queen c4 and then e4, queen d3, e4, bishop takes rook e8. So this would have probably been a more accurate way, because f5 is coming, so we still win the piece. So instead I played e4 immediately, and after bishop takes, of course he shouldn't go bishop takes here, so I should go bishop h5, but then I was going to go rook f6. So here after rook e8, I think black is just winning. Rook e5, queen back, rook f6. So the rooks and the pieces are just too strong, and white doesn't have any counter attack here. So there's queen check, but we just play rook e8. And after rook check, king takes, queen takes, king g7. The problem is the white king is just way too weak. There's all these checks on the back, and there's no rook g1 check, or there's no counterplay here for white. After rook d1, queen check, king c2, we have queen e2 check. And now we see this bishop on h6 is very, very useful, because it's stopping the rook from going to d2, and now white loses the rook and loses the d5 pawn. So okay, and in the fourth game we were playing against Germany. So we won all three of our matches so far, But now we get into some of the really tough games. So this game was against Germany. We ended up tying 3-3, I believe. But this game could have really been a decider for this particular match. And as it turns out, it could have decided the whole event. So we went for this line where we take the pawn on c7, knight to f3, bishop drops back. So white is a pawn up, but black has a lot of compensation, so black should be pretty much at least equal here. He can also take back the pawn whenever he wants on a2. We play bishop to b3, so we don't really want to take the knight because then we give up our bishop pair and there's not much winning chances left in the position. Whereas here at least there's something to play for. I mean, position is still a little bit imbalanced. h3 to stop any back rank mates. And here we just double and see if we can get any small advantage at all. I think knight a5 might have been a slight mistake because afterwards it's very difficult for him to defend the a6 pawn. The position looks good for white, but it's not clear how we're going to break through and get a advantage. And definitely made a few inaccuracies here. Yeah, there's probably an inaccuracy, so maybe knight e5, like what the engine is suggesting, is a little bit better. Because after bishop c5, I didn't really want to move the bishop back to d6, nor did I want it to be captured on c5, so we just waste the move really. And yes, it says black is almost equal already, and now it's just equal. So it should just be fairly equal. But we managed to somehow win one of the queenside pawns. So the queenside pawn drops somehow. Let's see. Captures. So we're threatening checkmate there on f7. The queen goes back, and here I forgot that we could just play the move queen d6 check. This would have just been a much easier way, because after queen e7 captures, we can play knight check and then capture the pawn. And it's just a risk-free way to try and win this ending without queens on the board. Instead, after this one, so we're still winning this one, but with queens on the board it's a little bit trickier, and especially with low time on the clock. Yeah, I don't know about g4. Maybe we played g4 a little bit too early. Maybe I should just like waited around, play like queen e7 or queen c7. There's not much black can actually do, so we could have just taken our time maybe. And maybe here taking with the pawn would have been much better. But taking with the knight, it's hard to actually push through. Yeah, it's not that easy anymore. And I think king g3 here is probably the final mistake. So it says queen c7 and white is still a little bit better. Although I'm not exactly sure how white is going to push through and win this position. Doesn't look that clear. So could have played queen f1, but now he gives queen e5. So white is still okay. And apparently we should play the move pawn to f4. Although again, I'm not exactly sure how white is winning this after the move pawn to f4. Maybe we play f4, h5. But after knight h3, it's just a dead draw now. Especially we lose the pawn on h4, so yeah, just offered a draw here. So that was definitely a missed opportunity. And then in the very last round, I think we were playing Belarus, which was one of the top teams. So this was definitely going to be a tough match, but we had to try and win here on board 2. So we played for our usual Khan setup. So I'll go to Sicilian. So it's forced us into sort of a hedgehog structure, which we have to oblige. So it's part of playing the Khan, so you have to be comfortable with playing the hedgehog. So in hindsight, maybe I would have played the move h5 if I knew that he was going to go g4. But I don't think bishop d8 is a bad move by any means. It's just a very typical move. g4. So here, since we can't play h5, the only other way to stop his attack is to go for this h6. And sometimes you play g5 and knight e5 type of plan. Knight h7. So there's a very nice game here for black somewhere where black played pawn to g5 and maneuvered his knights to e5 and g6. I think it was something very similar to this. And here we can move our knight either to f6 or this knight to f6 to attack e4. So I went for this one. Maybe I should have played the other one. And then queen a8. Also a very normal idea, just putting pressure here. So the bishop can't go here because the pawn is hanging. And then next move is going to play h5 and just roll the pawns on the queen side, on the king side. So we need to do something about that. So I decided to play the move pawn to h5. So the idea is that if g5 we have knight to g4, just attacking the bishop on e3. And at least we have this like safe square on g4 now. And after takes, we take back. He went for this very sharp knight takes e6, which was very, very interesting and caught me off guard. I didn't see this at all. So we have to capture the sacrifice, of course. And after queen g6, his idea is that it hits the knight, it also hits the pawn on e6, and there's ideas of pawn to e5, attacking the knight on h7. So this is an extremely dangerous position for black. But we just need to defend carefully. So we should start with knight to f6. So e5, and we should give the piece back probably. So I played the move bishop to c6 to try and chase the queen. You want to chase dangerous pieces away. So computer's giving pawn takes here and queen to b8, but that looks quite difficult to spot. And I did not see that one in the game. So bishop c6. Takes. So bishop d4. Bishop e8. I think we were already quite low on time in this position. So the queen wants to transfer to f7, and then we want to set up this like knight h5 type of idea. Rook to e1, queen f7. And here finally we play b5. It took us a very long time to play b5, but we finally managed to get it in. Rook g2 captures. That's a free pawn on c4, so I don't see why we can't take it. Bishop c2 and now rook c7. So in hindsight, probably knight h5 is better, but in the time pressure we wanted to be super safe and just played rook c7. But it seems like knight h5 here is good. I was most worried about this one, but I think it says bishop to f6 and queen takes f6 is okay for black. So after knight to e4, we play knight to h5, queen to g4, queen takes f4. So apparently this is now equal. Although there's so many tricks still in this position. And here we were really, really low on time. And this was just a really bad mistake. Sort of like a panic. Because after rook f4, and now I have to play g5. And yeah, in the game wasn't sure what to do after the move rook to g4 here, which probably would have just picked up a piece on g3 or h4. So the idea is that it's attacking the knight, but if I move the knight, then here's rook to h4. and I can't take back because of this pin. So instead my opponent went for something very, very fancy. So he took here on g3, bishop takes, and then played the move knight to g3, which, I mean, it's quite a good way to play because I was so low on time, and the idea is that he just wants to checkmate with knight h6, and the power of these two bishops on the long diagonals sort of makes sense. Really, there's not too many moves for black apart from this one, and it just seems to work out perfectly. So play the move bishop to g6, king across, and now white would like to take the rook and then checkmate on h8, but unfortunately it doesn't quite work because we just take the bishop on c2. So bishop takes, rook takes, and now we take here. So everything just works out perfectly, and we're still a pawn up with a passed c pawn. And the rest of the game is both players under a lot of time pressure. Black trying to hold on to the pawns and promote them. Eventually we force white to sacrifice the bishop. So this should be winning for black. We just have to keep an eye on these two passed pawns on the side. And there's a nice tactic at the very end. So here white was threatening rook check. So we went rook check, and then rook here, and I thought the final position there's a nice bit of geometry happening here because white lost on time, but he was trying to find a move. It was quite difficult. So the idea is that if white goes rook check, king b5, he can't play b7 because bishop f4 check would pick up the rook and would also stop the pawn. And if he tries to play the move rook takes bishop and pawn push, it almost works if not for the fact that we have rook check and then rook back to e8. And the final point was that if white tries to play rook to g7, then we have the move bishop to b2 check, picking up the rook on the g7 square.